Hello everyone, I'm Jonas, and today I will be discussing lighting, and specifically lighting in UDK. This is intended to become a series eventually, so this one is introduction with some theory and examples, as well as me showing you basically how I built up my Knossos level, which I will include in the comment below, and if you want to play with it you can just download it from Dropbox and make any kind of changes you want to see what happens. The reasons, whoops, I've been drawing here already, whatever. The reasons for lighting. Basically, creating contrast is probably the most important part of lighting, because I'll take up my example here and hide this. If you start out with the sort of full bright or unlit mode in UDK, you can see that everything is extremely boring and everything mostly looks the same. The full bright in Hammer is also extremely boring, and I'd actually rather have something like a lit mode with no textures instead of textures and unlit, because I really like this sort of gray with colored lighting effect, but the unlit mode here is extremely boring. And if I take up my number 2 here, leading the players, it's not just leading them gameplay wise, but also leading through just helping to lead the eye, because if you don't have any sort of contrast, everything will be equally important to the eye. So you can't lead the eye somewhere, and there's nowhere to rest. If I compare again to the detail lighting here, you can basically see that in the middle here, this is dark and unimportant. Anything that's lighter will take more focus, and you'll think more about this. The example I have here is the one I'm going to build on later, so it doesn't have much lighting to begin with. I deleted most of it just to kind of show from the start. And I have number 3 here as well, establish a mood. You basically have to have a theme for your map before you start detailing it. The theme I have for this one is basically a sort of afternoon-ish desert style map with a lot of dust, which I will include later as a fog effect. But if I start with these, I have some examples here from Team Fortress 2. For instance, I have Gold Rush here. The theme is already set here. It's maybe sort of evening, as well as a deserty type place. This is Gold Rush, obviously, but as you can see here, creating contrast with lighting is really important, because it helps the player notify where to look for enemies. Like you can see here, these areas, as well as over here, this is basically the 3 points of interest. Around the corner here is more lighting, because there's a lighter place as well, and everything here is basically things that the player doesn't have to worry as much about. Like the opponents can't be here. Sure, you could have another lighting, like this light doesn't seem to be on, but you could have some lighting here as well, because players can actually be standing up. But everything else is helping the player ignore basically part of this. So as you can see here, everything outside the playable area is darker as well, but everything inside the playable area will have a decent amount of light no matter what. And if I switch to Pipeline here, which is actually a nighttime map, the contrast itself is much higher. As you can see, this in the top here, I can't even draw with black because it just disappears. But everything at the top is much darker, but the gameplay area is still pretty much as bright as it is on the daytime map, which is Gold Rush, because lighting is it's supposed to help gameplay. It's not just for detailing, which is, it can be as well. For instance, the windows up here, this is just detailing. There is probably no reason to have this be light except for the detailing, but this doesn't spill over. Like the windows up here, it doesn't stream across so that this wall is light. It's just the ground and the gameplay area should always have a certain lowest level of light, and then you use something like colored light here to notify that this is an important area, the top here, and this area around the corner as well. This is all important parts of gameplay area, and this is just sort of the default basic. Here is light as well. If I switch to double cross, which is an even more obvious example, you can see here, this is also a nighttime map. So this is important. This could be brighter in my opinion, but everything out here is basically the default level of brightness. And then here is an entrance in the middle as well. So basically, since you can jump from the bridge here up to the roof, this has to be bright as well. I would probably prefer like to have a fence or something here so that everything up here could be dark as well, and just allow players to move on this one, because that's the most important part. So you could just raise the wall here and then have everything be dark. So this is unimportant basically. This is point of interest for the eye, and this over here could be brighter and this could be brighter, just to help lead the eye. This is probably the perfect amount on the roof here. Creating the contrast is extremely important, and the components which we use for creating these things is, number one is sunlight. So the first thing you should be doing, even before the first gameplay test, in my opinion, in UDK, is just to, yeah, this is on screen, take a dominant directional light, which should be representing sunlight or even moonlight. You should have a dominant directional light in every map, in my opinion at least. So if we just take that, it's now noon and the light is just pointing straight down and it's extremely white. For this map, I've obviously already chosen a direction for my sunlight to stream, because the map is basically built around a certain level. Like if I point it here, you can see in the top right part here that the colonnade, sort of the floor over here, is supposed to be brightened by the sunlight, as well as there should be light streaming through the bars here, something like that. Yeah, and yeah, I have bars there as well, and on the inside here the light should be streaming through the windows, so I'm basically just gonna tilt the light a little bit more towards something like that. So I have light on the wall here, and then what you should be doing is going into the light color here, because in my opinion you should never really be using a white light, and you shouldn't be using a lot of colored light as well. Either go towards the blue side if you want a cooler map, something like nighttime map or anything like that, and then you go towards yellow for sunlight. So I'll pick a it's not super yellow, but a little bit. That's probably not the right color, but too saturated, so I'll turn that down a bit, and a little bit towards red. The color is not so important right now. So we'll just roll with that. So as you can see here, I've created a lot of contrast, but the some of the gameplay parts are super dark, as well as I've got some unnecessary highlighting as well, which I won't be doing much about. But if I just jump into it and play from here, you can see that it's extremely dark in the shadow areas, and I'd say it's decently bright in the direct lighting. So ambient occlusion will do a lot of things for that. Like everything in here will be much brighter once you compile it with decent compile settings. I've actually prepared all these, so I do have a step 2, which is the Skybox. So I'll just open the next map, Skydome, and here I have a prepared, compiled sunlight. So as you can see on the walls here, it's much brighter, and this is just ambient occlusion. So the renderer takes care of all that. Just adding a skylight will do a ton of things for your map. If you want to, you can also use a skylight if you want it for extremely early testing. What this does is basically it raises the lighting on everything. So if you just want to drop in sunlight or a dominant directional light, and then you take something like a 0.25 a skylight, you can get a playable map instantly without having to worry about any playable areas. What the skylight does is basically it adds light from every direction from the top here. You can also turn it on to do it from the bottom, I think. But yeah, if you just pop in one of those, you can have a map playable instantly without having to worry about lighting at all. So that's just in case you want it for testing. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend including a skylight at all. The only thing it does is it basically increases brightness but removes all contrast, basically. There is some difference between light and shadow, but it's not much. So for step number 2 here, what I will do is insert Skybox, which it will not do much for the lighting itself, but it will have a really big effect on how you perceive the lighting. For instance, if we take a super dark Skybox here, everything will like it will feel darker compared to if I take whoops, it's not visible. If I take this for instance, because the light the eye basically registers all this as light, even though the map itself is not any lighter. So you will get higher contrast, for instance, when you look in different directions depending on what the skybox looks like. But having a skybox will also make a really big difference for early playtesting, and I'd recommend adding one as well, just because it adds so much ambience. Now there are really few skyboxes included in the UDK. This one looks kind of weird. But just pick one and roll with it, unless you're really good at making your own, in which case you will have excellent ambience for pretty much all your maps, because Skybox is one of the most important things for setting the mood. So just having one is really important. So I have sunlight, I have Skybox. The next step is fog, and you might not think that you need fog for every map, but you pretty much do. Atmospheric fog it makes a really big difference for how you perceive depth. If you look at someone who's doing like digital matte painting or something, Like I really like Feng Zhu. I think it's the ZGD school or something. He does a lot of tutorials on YouTube. And if you watch him paint, you can see that he really does work with the basically just painting over a really low opacity white over everything to simulate depth fog. So I go back to actor classes, I add fog, just a height fog here. It's enabled. God, I don't remember. This is too much, but I just want to show you. Oops, no, it's way too much. Oops. Lots of whoopsies. Fog is really sensitive to changes. So you just increase it for a bit. You change the color again to something like your sunlight. Because I wanted this map to be like sort of sandy, dusty map. So going with a yellower color it makes more sense. And you can also set a start distance, which I would always recommend. So if you just look away towards the end here, I will just toggle this on and off, and you can see how big a difference that makes. Even if I'd kept it at the original setting, which was 0.5, adding this will do so much for depth perception. And you can also see that everything becomes brighter because fog basically simulates the light bouncing off of the fog particles. So it makes it's basically like ambient occlusion because it bounces light everywhere instead of just straight down from the sun. So I'd recommend this. It's mostly a mood thing and for depth perception, but it will actually affect your lighting. So the next step here is gameplay lighting, which I call basically the lowest amount of brightness you can have. Like if I take up the pipeline one again, everything down on the ground here should have one of these lowest brightness levels. So as you can see, the ground here outside the spawn, this is basically the lowest amount, and then you have extra brightness towards the spawn. So whoops, I just opened the other one. This is obviously with a compiled lighting and everything. So the density of the fog here was really extreme. It probably is in the video on YouTube that I put up of this map as well. But as you can see here, everything is really sort of dusty, it's sandy. That's basically the effect I wanted. It might not make much sense given that all of my textures on the ground here is basically bricks and sort of tiles. But I'm going with it anyway. I would like to have a sort of swirly cloud thingy around the map here, saying that it's sort of a sandstorm or something like that. I just don't really know how to make it. I suppose a cylinder with some sort of panning texture would do. So here I have the finished sunlight and fog, and all of these sort of shadowy areas are still super dark. I do have one light here. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to actually do anything. I'll try and copy it and see. That's sort of weird. You're supposed to get a... Oh, it's brightness 0, that's why. So keeping in mind that you have to do, let's say, yeah, I'll just run with 1 for brightnesses. And maybe do it, yeah, sort of orange. The entire theme for this map is basically orange and blue, so there should be water in these places. I just had really big problem with water. So once you've identified the areas that need more lighting, you basically go in with a prop, something like the lamp here, add a lamp. You can either use the emissive part of this, where are we? Lighting, nope. You can use emissive, which is under light mask settings, or you can just attach a light, which I will do, because the standard lights, as you can see here, they brighten it up in the editor, but emissive lights you have to compile to get any effect. So for demonstrative purposes, I will use real lights, or whatever you want to call it. Like, obviously I'm not putting much thought into the placement of these lights as of right now. This one is probably 0 as well. Yep. So I can just, as you can see here, I basically finished the map to begin with, and then I realized that I wanted to make a sort of introduction to lighting. So I have a lot of lights placed in map already. I've just turned them off because I couldn't really be arsed to go through the map and delete them all. So as you can see here, everything becomes a lot brighter, and I would say, even though you have the sort of contrast in this area, it's basically at the level of playable. What you want the player to do is to always be able to identify threats. So if you have a game where the silhouettes are really similar, for instance, like it is in Unreal, you have to be able to pick out the weapon of your opponent in any given case. Like if you have Team Fortress 2, where the silhouettes of the characters are really easily identifiable, you basically know the weapon that they have, so you might be able to turn down lighting a bit, but I wouldn't recommend it. So again, I have a really dark place over here. I'll just turn on the light, which I already have. Given that I'm using the same brightness for all the lights everywhere, I'm basically doing it wrong, because as I said before, having brighter lights, for instance in this hallway here, if I turn this up to 1.5 or 2, yeah, let's make it really over the top. As you can see here, no matter where you are, you will always see this entrance here, and your eye will be pulled toward it, even though you have a lot of things in the way. Now, the contrast is not going to be as big as it is in the editor, because the light scattering from the ambient occlusion will make a really big impact on these once you compile it. So basically what you want to do is go through the map and add lights. For instance, I have yeah, I'm doing it the wrong way now. Like, I generally prefer to use spotlights instead of these standard circular or spherical lights, which is point lights. I prefer spotlights because they give you bigger control over what you want to light up and what you want to still be dark, basically. For instance, I can take one of these spotlights here and place it in front of this, and it will only brighten up the actual playable area, and it won't do so much for the like the walls, which are unimportant. So you can pick and choose depending on the situation. Everything is obviously going to change. In some cases you will still want to use the normal point lights, but I'd say start out with spotlights, because it also helps you to reduce the amount of detail. Basically, you want the player to have areas where you can rest the eye, basically, because then you know that it's not important. Everything here is really dark. I'm just trying to find an area that I can show you. So yeah, basically this wall here. Everything here is supposed to be dark because the player can never come out of these doors, or nothing will ever happen from this side. So that doesn't have to be bright. Like up here I have lights, or I have the props from lights, but everything up here is still not important. The only part that's important is basically the staircase going up the side there. So I want more brightness on the floor here, but I don't really want more on the wall, because it's places where no player can ever come from. So I will move on from this one, and I will instead show you I could have brought this one up. Like number 5 here is, once you have the gameplay lighting, which is basically the lowest amount that's required everywhere. As you can see here, I've really turned it up. This is probably too bright. You still want to have a nice contrast between the light and dark areas, and you will also want 0.2, 0.25. Yeah, you really want to be able to highlight the exits and entrances, like I've done on this side. This is like the area in the middle here is probably too dark still, but if I had something like this over here as well, this is still enough to easily identify any threats, and no one can really hide in the shadows here, and you still have a nice contrast between the exit to the next area and the gameplay area itself. Here I've also been doing some work with color lighting. You don't have to if you don't want to. It's probably smarter to stay away from anything except for the yellowish and the bluish sort of colors. If you use the emissive, you will obviously always get light of the same color as the model or the texture is. So that's one easy way to have the light match up with the model. But yeah, so detail lighting is one of the hardest parts actually, because by creating details where no details really are necessary. For instance, this area up here, I've created something that looks like a gameplay area, and it's lit and everything, but no player can ever get up here. So making this area to begin with is probably a mistake, because you should never distract the player. Every time, for instance, you come out here, you might say, oh, the brighter places in here, this is probably important, this is probably important, and this is probably important, which is actually a mistake, because this is completely not important. So I probably shouldn't have made this to begin with. Let's pretend it's something like that instead. Like I have a pretty low contrast down here. This might need more highlighting. Like if you're ever worried about whether you're doing the right or the wrong thing, just sort of relax your eyes so that you're not focusing on anything and look where the contrast is. You can also switch to lighting only, which will make this easier because it helps, or it makes you less distracted by the textures. Like textures will still affect how the light looks, but just occasionally switching to the detail lighting mode here, Alt 5, it will help you identify sort of problem areas and where you need more contrast. Like maybe you need a little more in here. The interior might be a little more lit. This is probably too even, maybe a bit too yellow. So just moving through the map here, working on the gameplay lighting, making sure that everything is easily identifiable. Like here I have these lights, which is just detail lighting, which is probably a mistake. If I switched these to spotlights, it would be much easier to do more concentrated lighting on the gameplay area itself, while still keeping the wall here sort of a relaxed place. Given that I mean those must be super weak, so they don't make much of a difference. So that's unnecessary. I would give more comments on detail lighting, but it's actually less important. Once you have the basics down with everything is bright enough while still keeping interesting contrasts in places where like you don't have to ever go in this corner here, for instance. There is no reason to go there except if you're trying to evade someone who's following you. So this might be a little brighter. I'm basically just trying to create sort of interesting looking areas while still keeping everything brightly enough lit. So detail lighting, it's more like it needs to be really obvious that this is not important from a, let's say for instance, you can take height. In something like UDK or Unreal, where people don't really rocket jump to super high heights, something that's, this is probably 128 units high or something. So once you have 2 of these, so 256 units, like anything up there is obviously not going to be important. So at that point you can add sort of detailing up there, or you can have they're over on this side. You can have these sort of grates that show no, you cannot move through here, but you can have a detailed sort of area outside that. Something like that. I would recommend starting with the sort of gameplay, because if you get the gameplay down, the detailing is basically not that important, though I will come back to that in a later lecture. So this is all for today. Hope you gotten something out of it, and the next time I will be focusing more on sort of light map scale, light functions, maybe working with different sort of lights and shadows. So that's all for today. Thank you for watching. The map is included below, so check it out if you want to.